All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Early Childhood Development for Sustainable Development live webinar series. This is our second to last webinar. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Early Childhood Development. So I'm just connecting up with YouTube, so I think we should be good to go. Please feel free to write in questions into the chat. Although because I will be both managing the chat and the questions, I won't be typing in as much. I did to connect with all of our course participants today. And just again, a reminder, our last live webinar will be hosted this coming Monday with Dr. Jack Shonkoff. So we're really excited for that as well. So thank you to everyone who was able to join us live today, and for everyone who's watching later on. We've had such a great experience with the course and with all the course participants. So again, just thank you so much. And feel free to write in questions into the chat dialog box that's on the side of the YouTube screen. We have a couple questions coming from the online discussion forum. And so I think our first one here will come from our course participant Gladys Ayala. Say, I'm concerned about child-serving agencies such as health, behavioral health, education, responders, and criminal justice that are charged with providing a safe and healthy environment for children and their families that don't recognize or understand that children who come into contact with these services have experienced significant psychological trauma. In view of that, these organizations seem to have no interest in building a systematic approach with these systems or working to really address the complex trauma and challenges that children are facing. Oftentimes, these different institutions even define trauma in different ways or have different knowledge bases about what to do and how to approach it. And sometimes these child-serving services don't even pay attention to it. So I think this is a great issue and really important, brings up a couple of different themes of the course. So one of them is this idea of integration across different systems or institutions. And so I think this can happen within the same institution. So for example, within government agencies, the Ministry of Education, some of these other institutions that are publicly supported, they might not be collaborating. This also includes working across different institutional bases, right? So how do we coordinate the private sector with the public sector, or community-based organizations or activism with NGOs or other organizations? And I think this is such an important point. And just to start off by saying that there is no easy or straightforward answer, and that it's very different in various cultural contexts or country contexts, and that this is one thing that's exciting about the field of early childhood development right now, which is all the work and experience that's starting to be accumulated about how this can be accomplished. Different organizations have had different approaches to this, but I think it's also important to first recognize why there might be reluctance to do this. So for example, why wouldn't the Ministry of Health be interested in collaborating with the Ministry of Education? And so I think sometimes organizations and institutions have to work in a competitive environment, maybe working for grants or for government support or funding or for control over certain issues or populations. And so I think organizations come in with that mindset that, oh, if we're able to protect our own programs or services, that will give us more leverage, or if we were to share information or collaborate with another ministry or institution, then we would necessarily have to lower our status or something like that. In the same way that throughout this course we've talked about changing different individuals' attitudes or behavior, or changing parents' behavior or caretakers' behavior, I think it's just as important that we have to change the behavior of people in positions of power, right? So like the Minister of Health or people higher up in these different institutions, and emphasize the potential of collaboration. And we make the case for how can we sell leveraging early childhood education or working on intersectoral collaboration. And I think one of the most important parts of collaboration is about sharing data and information. Dr. Hirokazu Yoshikawa and I have just been talking about the importance of having a line across different sectors, so that information that's collected by the Ministry of Health can be shared with the Ministry of Education, so that direct service providers have a holistic approach to a child. So I think those are really important concerns to. And then one thing I think that's important is elevating issues such as early childhood development or trauma that are so clearly intersectoral, that to fully address any aspect of them, you have to look at the child as a whole child, and look at the child within the context of the family. And I think this holistic perspective is really important to have in relation to a number of different things, such as considering early childhood development within the greater context of society. I think a traditional approach to addressing different issues has been to think of problems or challenges as acute or discrete concerns, acute, discrete, targeted intervention. But really, a lot of these challenges are multifaceted and holistic and require a very integrated and holistic approach. So Gladys, thank you so much for bringing up this issue. I think this is something a lot of different countries and governments are working on right now. And so we're really excited that we've been sort of developing this course, and that many of you here have your own experiences and your own background to bring to this issue. So again, I'd just like to encourage you to please continue writing in questions into the chat box so that we can have some interaction here. But I'm going to move on to a response to Gladys's question, interesting, which comes to us from Pooja Padbiri. I agree with the need for some systematic approach. In one of the previous sessions, cultural expectations play a huge role. Would you agree? The example used about shyness being looked at as a positive in earlier generations, but is not acceptable anymore. To find a common ground would be hard when cultural norms differ. Where there might be easy consensus on physical trauma, secure attachment has so many variations these days. In India, a child sleeping with parent is very much the norm because parents do not consider nighttime to be a parenting free time. They need a parent no matter what time of day. However, with access to opinions, blogs, parent stories online, many mothers have started resenting their child not sleeping through the night, which is not typical anyhow. How do we create a checklist that applies to all of us equally? A really important issue to bring to the table, which is that a lot of these concerns in early childhood development are culturally specific or influenced by the context in which a child is living. So I think just one example here comes from some work we've been doing with the organization Save the Children, which is about developing measures to assess child development. Right, so one of the recent challenges for the field is that for a 3-year-old, for a 4-year-old child, how do you get a sense of the holistic development status of a child? I've been working on an instrument called the EDELA, and we've been analyzing some of the psychometric properties for it. And so it's a holistic measure of children's development and includes social emotional development items. And one of the sections of the assessment focuses on what might be an appropriate response to a child who has been hurt. And you can imagine this is something that varies greatly across different contexts, right? So in some countries, it was appropriate for, if a child had been hurt, someone might respond and say, oh, you'll be fine. It'll be okay. You'll be fine. But in another cultural context, it's much more important that someone acknowledge the hurt and say, it's okay to be sad or it's okay to feel hurt. Deemed an appropriate response or a socially intelligent response to a child being hurt will vary depending on the cultural context. So then in developing this measure of children's development, we need to include this type of variation to allow for the assessment of child development to respond to different cultural contexts. Right, so Pooja's example of bed sharing, I think, is another perfect example of how across different cultures and contexts, different families might value different aspects of child development. Right, in one context, independence and sleeping through the night might be the most important thing in a certain period of child's development. And so certain families might encourage a child at a certain age to sleep apart from their parents. But in another area that focuses on connection or accordance or community engagement, then bed sharing might be a more appropriate practice for that area. There are definitely some universal standards to consider, especially in relation to violence or trauma. But in a lot of other respects, there's both dependent contexts or also variation to the degree of certain concerns. So I think an example of that is child labor, right? Where in some cultures and communities, it's in the same way we've discussed in this course, the idea of intent participation being a really powerful way for a child to learn. to engage a child in the work and activity of a household or a family is a way in which for that child to be socially integrated into that family and learning different skills and competencies by being integrated into work. However, the degree to which a child is integrated and the types of activities that a child is completing is extremely important. You can imagine that on an extreme end, that might be considered child labor. And if a child is over-involved in different types of activities, that might be detrimental to their health and to their well-being. A degree, not just the specific practice. So I think it's really important that we as a community working on early childhood development move forward in trying to think about defining universal standards or norms and coming up with measurements so that across health, education in different countries and cultures, we're about moving all children together. But at the same time, we preserve the space and the ability that these tools must be adapted and must be informed by different cultural practices and contexts, because that is the utmost of importance, especially in relation to very young children. And so this is, I think, a point, if anyone was able to read this recent paper we just wrote on parents' perceptions of early child education, I think this is an area where we need much more research about understanding cultures and environments. Parents, what are their goals for their children's development, and how do we as a professional community meet that aspiration and perspective of parents and communities so that children's development is defined and worked on in a very collaborative and cohesive manner. I think in one of these discussions, it's important to consider not only culture and context, but factors such as an urban or rural environment or timing, the beginning of a child's development, very, very early ages or at later ages. So great, thank you so much. We're receiving some questions in the chat. So I'm going to read, we have a question from S. Zuid. So he writes, in reference to the reading about the Madrasa AC program, how was the program funded? And he also asks, what does it mean that it integrates Islamic integrated active learning pedagogy? And asks, do non-Muslim children participate in this program? So this is a great question. Thank you so much, Zuid, for writing in. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this program is that the funding changes over time. Across our early childhood program, this was initiated by both community organizations and then the Aga Khan Development Foundation. So this is an international NGO working in a number of different contexts. The Aga Khan Foundation received funding and so uses the funding coming from the NGO to initiate the program and start the program in particular communities that were interested. So in certain parts of Kenya and then later Uganda and Tanzania, there was concern that certain populations weren't receiving access to high quality early childhood care, childhood education. And so they were interested in creating opportunities, quality, but also sustainable. And so the Aga Khan Foundation has been working on developing this phase-out model. And so what happens is the NGO, with their expertise and organization focused on creating early childhood care and education opportunities, would initiate the program. So work on establishing a school or a center within communities, and then partnering with various individuals in the communities. But a big part of the program is that parents and other community members and particularly community leaders are really actively involved in the program. So that what happens is over the first couple years of the program, the Aga Khan Foundation slowly transfers ownership over to the community. So while initial funding and support comes from the Aga Khan Foundation, maybe the space or the labor to create a structure or other inputs around food or resources are coming from the community. So even from the very beginning, there are these mixed sources of support. But then over the first couple years of the program, the Aga Khan Foundation gradually transfers ownership completely over to the community and to parents. Through the community organization, either through direct payments from parents or through community organizing and fundraising, that for 5 years, the program is completely funded by the community itself and only receives indirect inputs, such as maybe teacher training or other types of support from the Aga Khan Foundation. So I think that model is really interesting. But what's most important is that from the very beginning, there's this emphasis on community engagement and community involvement. So that as this transfer process continues, everyone is fully aware of what's happening and that the community is continually stepping up in organizing its ownership. And so at this point, In Uganda, there is an organization developed from community participation, so from parents and other people involved in the community, that is now, so in charge of running many of the schools. Sometimes an independent school will just be monitored and owned by the community, but that's the process. That's a really wonderful question. So to follow up with the second question about what it means to integrate Islamic principles into the pedagogy, this is about, a little bit related to what we were just talking about making early childhood relevant and important to the culture and community from which children come. And so I think this is a really interesting opportunity and sometimes, challenge for early childhood practitioners to first learn and understand something of the community and understand what is important for children's development, what is important for other family members, and what do they aspire and what do they want their children to be learning during this period of their lives. So one example I have is that sometimes religion is an extremely important part of a community and parents' goals and aspirations for their children. And so then it makes sense that it can be integrated into the pedagogy and into the activities of the center. And so I think one example of this in the Madrasa Early Childhood Program about a really wonderful synergy between Islamic principles and early childhood development is the issue of hygiene, right? And so the practice of ablutions and washing one's hands before prayer, before entering a mosque, is something that's really important for child development as well, and for children to learn the importance of washing their hands and taking care of water treatment and general hygienic practices around the early childhood center. So that's an example of where a cultural or religious practice perfectly aligns with something that might be of importance to children's development. And so that's integrated into the pedagogy of the Madrasa Childhood Program. An example of something that's not quite as direct or easily transferable is the issue of language. Some madrasa centers around the world are often very strict and very didactic and are just about learning principles of Arabic and memorization. And that often, especially for very young children, isn't the most developmentally appropriate practice. The Early Childhood Program has done is that they integrate, because the Arabic language is so important to many Islamic principles, children are also learning some basic letters and numbers in Arabic as part of the madrasa program, but in a way that's developmentally appropriate. In non-Muslim areas, or in areas where there might be some children who come from a Muslim background and some children who don't, sometimes what's happening in the madrasa program is that the class just divides up during this time. So the non-Muslim children do one activity and the Muslim children go to the nearby mosque. But this is definitely something that could be challenging and will vary depending upon where this program is implemented. Right, so is the madrasa program being implemented in a homogeneous, completely Muslim area, or is it an area where it's more heterogeneous and there's some Muslim children and some non-Muslim children? And so I think that's a process of negotiation, and that's about interacting between the parents and the community to make sure the school is addressing all the needs of all children, is as inclusive as possible. So this is something that Uganda has been able to do very well, but that's also because Uganda has a long-standing tradition of Muslim and non-Muslim populations collaborating and integrating, and there not being a real source of tension there. In our context, that might be much more difficult. And so I think that's about the practice of working with the community and really understanding the way in which the beginning of children's social and emotional development. There are examples from Ireland where there's been long-standing issues of conflict, high tension running between Protestant and Catholic communities. And certain early childhood programming there has been about developing from the very beginning social emotional curriculum and pedagogy that focuses on reducing prejudice and keeping children open-minded and combating some of the challenges that exist in children's environment. So I think we've all noticed that, certain issues of racism or prejudice or discrimination begin, children are exposed to that from very, very early ages. So I think it's interesting to consider early childhood as one of the points at which you can combat them. So there are a number of different programs and interventions around the world that are thinking about this and addressing it, but it's definitely a challenge, and in certain areas it can be more difficult than others. In the programs that I visited for the Madrasa Early Childhood Program, it was really, I think, a source of the program, that the early childhood centers really reflected the community. And so the community included both Muslim and non-Muslim children, and thus the program adapted to serve these different children's needs. So thank you so much for that question. All right, so following up, we have a question from Aisha Bano. Bring awareness on social construction of gender in early childhood development. Do we have studies on such issues? So I think this is a great question, and this is definitely not my area of expertise, so I definitely encourage you to look out and research and investigate, but I think this is an area that is relatively new. And like I was just talking about before with issues such as religion, something like gender can be really difficult to address in a culturally sensitive approach, especially when parents might have differing views. Right? So if you can consider, parents are such an important stakeholder in early childhood development, and maybe they agree with what a school does, or maybe they disagree and have. So this is, definitely a challenge, but I think it is an issue. And like I was saying before, children are exposed to these beliefs from birth. It's not necessarily too early ever in early childhood to develop this, and to think about ways in which can be gender neutral in a certain way, right? So not encouraging girls to play with certain toys and boys to play with certain toys. But I think modeling is really important. There's a lot of really wonderful children's literature to be developed, issues around gender and identity. And so I think that early childhood programming can reach out to these different resources and learn about how to be as open as possible and inclusive and supportive, especially around issues related to bullying, support and encouragement for children who might identify in different ways. So I think most of the things that I've seen about this are from children of slightly earlier ages, so in primary school and in the US context. So I think this is a great opportunity to consider some of these issues internationally, where example of a study conducted in the United States might not transfer to other contexts as well. And so I think there's definitely the need for more research and more investigation about how we can best provide these environments for very young children. But this isn't my area of expertise, so I don't really know what would be the best example or model of that. But definitely an area for future research, so a very important issue. Thank you so much for raising that. All right, so we have a question from Mari Ullman, who says, could you share examples of effective early childhood development programs in emergency contexts, for instance, for young refugees? So I think this is a great question, a really important issue. I think we are recognizing more and more that children are, that early childhood development has to recognize contexts such as refugee contexts or internally displaced people or children facing situations of conflict. I think this is extremely important. I think this is also an area where we have a lot of room for growth. So I think certain organizations such as the International Rescue Committee, IRC, and Save the Children and many other organizations have been working on developing these resources. But again, this is still a relatively new environment to consider for early childhood. But there are some really wonderful examples and different programs being developed. Lead professor, Hiro Yoshikawa, has been working with Sesame Street and the International Rescue Committee to develop programs, interventions, and content for Syrian children living in Lebanon and Jordan. So this is a program that is they're currently applying for a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. But both the International Rescue Committee and Sesame working on developing programs that recognize the trauma that children might have suffered in the context in which they are working, and not just necessarily focusing on children, but also how to reach parents and families as an entire community and sort of targeted intervention, not thinking about working with children in isolation, but recognizing whether in refugee camps or in settlement communities, how to interact with and work the severe challenges that children are facing. So another model that's been working or that there's been research on is from Catalina Torrente and Larry Aber. So Larry Aber is the co-director along with Hiro Yoshikawa of the Global Ties Research Center. So this is Global Ties for Children. It's at a research center based at NYU that is focused on investigating effective interventions and policy for working with children. And one of the important streams of research is focusing on conflict situations. So there's been some research in the Republic of Congo, which is an area where there's been long-standing issues of conflict and insecurity. And so this intervention was with the International Rescue Committee. It's a program they have called Healing Classrooms. And this was important for recognizing the trauma and challenges that children face, but also it's important to recognize the importance of caregivers, and that teachers and early childhood practitioners and other individuals in this community are also facing traumatic situations, and that the welfare of teachers is also an important thing to consider. So they had research of there in the Congo, and so I think this is a really exciting growth and development phase that for the most part has focused on primary education, but I think more and more is increasingly recognizing the needs of very young children, and then how to not only just work through schools and other interventions that directly target, but to work with the entire family and work with supporting parents and encouraging high quality parenting behaviors. So here I think there are a lot of interesting different models for delivery, but recognizing unique needs, like one of the unique aspects of the programming that they're considering for refugee situations in Lebanon and Jordan is that oftentimes families that are living in refugee camps don't necessarily have many activities, right? Sort of refugees are often prohibited from working in a new country context. So then, families are often all present without much to do. So you have an intervention that in a more stable context might be focused on working with one individual child who is, 1 or 2 years old, and then a single parent. But how might you adapt or change that program to be able to encounter, okay, what happened if the home visitor or the community health worker goes to a family and there are both parents present and an aunt and an uncle and 2 and 3 other children? How might you adapt that program to address that context, which is fairly familiar across different refugee settings? Most of my own work is in Uganda. And there, Uganda has a wonderful longstanding policy being very welcoming and supportive of refugees. And currently there's a really intense situation with people fleeing some of the violence in South Sudan. And so in parts of the West Nile region in Uganda, parts of northern Uganda, more and more refugees are coming. Organizations are interested in addressing and working in those populations. But so I think this is a great question. There are a number of interesting organizations and interventions and programs that are working, but it's still relatively new. So we have a couple examples, but I think hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll learn more and more about how we can best support these populations, because unfortunately, increasingly more and more children around the world are facing these challenging situations. And I think it's a huge area for need. We have a follow-up question from Zuid asking about the issue of cultural sensitivity, and saying cultural sensitivity is essential, but what happens when a norm for one culture norms of another? It gives the example of female genital cutting. And so I think this is a perfect example of where some universal standards do exist. So I think any practice that might inflict severe bodily harm upon a child or a young person, I think community, we have agreed that this must be addressed. But I think what's important is that even when we've identified a universal standard, such as inflicting bodily harm and severe bodily harm upon a young person, the most effective ways to address that must be culturally sensitive, right? So I think some of the interventions addressing female genital cutting are when they integrate leaders and high-profile figures from within the community to act as ambassadors for changing a certain practice or arguing against a certain practice. I think another example of this, or some of the challenges here, is for so the practice of either parents or teachers, maybe spanking or beating a child as a disciplinary practice. And I think in certain areas, teachers, there's a lot of pushback if the intervention comes in and presents itself as a human rights framework or other types of interventions. I think many parents rightly will respond and saying, oh, that's just a Western outsider perspective. Like, you don't know my family necessarily, or you don't know our culture. So I think it's really important for even very extreme behaviors to always have an approach that acknowledges, one, that even in the face of violence or extreme challenges, that there's still strengths within a community, and to build on those strengths to combat some of the more negative practices. So in relation to corporal punishment, I think there's a really wonderful organization in Uganda called Raising Voices that's working on changing some practices that happen at schools. So try to move away from the use of corporal punishment in schools. But I think this is, a very tricky and challenging issue, and it's really important that communication leaders from within the community to advocate for certain behaviors and not just say no to corporal punishment, but offer alternatives. And it's saying not the absence of punishment, but finding positive reinforcement or finding alternatives, and always working within the cultural context, even if it is recognized that there are certain practices that are definitely negative and detrimental to children's development. But it's a really important issue. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Okay, so we have a question from Beatriz Diaz-Torre, writing in from Mexico. So hi, Beatriz, thanks so much for writing in. And she says, it is difficult to get funds to evaluate and have reliable data on impact. Are there organizations interested in financing these essential processes to improve and scale? I think this is extremely important. Thank you so much for bringing up this issue. And so I think there are a couple of different concerns wrapped up in this. So one is the importance of evaluation and having reliable data on impact assessment. So I think first we can distinguish between different types of data, right? So I think one helpful distinction is between process evaluation and impact assessment, right? So process evaluation is about determining whether your intervention is being implemented in the way it was intended to be implemented. Are materials getting delivered? Are the number of people getting trained? Is this happening in the way that the program was envisioned? Is about determining whether that intervention had an impact on outcomes, whether that affected any change on the behaviors or outcomes that you're interested in. So this distinction, I think, can be important, especially in relation to deciding when and where to collect data, because Beatriz is exactly right. Collecting data can be extremely expensive and time-consuming and draw upon a lot of the resources of an organization. So I think deciding when to collect data is a really important decision that I think often organizations just take for granted and sort of collect data for the sake of collecting data, but don't necessarily act on that data or learn from it. So I think an example of this distinction between process evaluation and impact assessment is, let's say our intervention is the development of a new textbook. Wonderful textbook, it's brand new curriculum, it's really great. The process evaluation is about determining, is this textbook actually reaching children? Now, I think in a lot of contexts, maybe the textbook will reach schools, but then the principal just keeps the textbook in their office, and it never actually gets into children's hands. These are questions about process evaluation, whether the intervention was implemented in the way that we've intended it to be implemented. Data should always be collected because an organization or institution that is implementing different interventions need to know whether those interventions are being implemented. Textbook or curriculum, and it's just getting out into prints and it's sitting in principals' offices somewhere or not even making it out of the warehouse, that's a problem. And we need to have recurring, regular feedback loops and collect information about how to make sure that our programs are being implemented in the way we see fit. Is the question of whether children's learning improve. Right? So the goal of the textbook is to improve children's learning. Maybe it's with science or reading or writing, but that would be impact assessment. So our intervention is textbooks. The process evaluation is determining whether the intervention was actually implemented, whether teachers are using the textbooks, whether children are actually reading them, whether they're integrated into the classroom. That's the process evaluation. And then impact assessment is determining whether that's actually improving children's learning or not. We only want to conduct the impact assessment when we're confident that the textbooks are being implemented in the way that they were intended to be implemented. Because you can imagine doing a really expensive and costly impact assessment, but if teachers aren't actually using the textbooks and in the textbook, right, you're not evaluating the impact of the intervention because it wasn't fully implemented. So I think as an organization, it's important to distinguish between, okay, what kind of data are we collecting and when, to determine what kinds of questions we want to ask or answer. So I think it's an important question for the organization that's implementing different interventions to consider at what point do we want to conduct impact assessment, and what data relates to what questions we are asking and answering as an organization. And we only want to collect data that we will immediately act upon or we're able to learn from, and not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. So, but thankfully there are different organizations now that are recognizing the importance of impact assessment, encourage different organizations and institutions to support this work. So an organization, for example, that I used to work with is called Innovations for Poverty Action. And it is affiliated with the Jameel Poverty Action Lab. I can send out more information about these organizations if people are interested, but these organizations are focused on conducting randomized control trials, which is the most effective methodology for conducting impact assessment. So these are different organizations that are working on building international and local expertise and experience around conducting high quality impact assessment, about working with different organizations and governments and policymakers to decide, okay, when might we do different interventions, and then how can we bring about and support them. Different funding organizations are 3IE, is an important illustration that's been funding a lot of impact assessment. Which is a branch of USAID, has been funding impact assessment. I think the World Bank and DFID and other organizations are becoming increasingly interested in impact assessment. But I think so a number of them have different funding opportunities, but I think across the board, all organizations, we should be focused on this communication about understanding when do we collect data, what kinds of data do we collect for which purposes, so we can be really strategic about deciding, okay, when might we apply for a grant and try and get more funding and support to be able to ask really rigorous questions and do an evaluation. Continually collect process evaluation. How do we integrate data collection into our regular, conducting activities of different organizations so that we're constantly learning and growing to both implement our programs in the highest fidelity and the highest strength, and then conducting rigorous impact assessment when it's most useful and when it can create the most learning. Okay, great. So we have a question about coming from Haifa. So says, the importance of any program for pre-primary education is to focus on active, creative, and outdoor play routines. And so depending on Vygotsky, so one of the important theorists behind early childhood development, says the curriculum. So I asked, do you think this is a good foundation for any curriculum for early childhood education? So I think this is a really wonderful and important point. But can be challenging in certain areas, right? Especially what we were talking about before about situations of conflict or crisis, natural disasters, really highly populated or densely populated urban areas. There are a lot of contexts and environments that aren't necessarily safe for children. And so it can be difficult for organizations to create that space so children feel free and are able to run and experience and developing their gross motor skills. Examples from our course was the mobile creche program in India, where this organization is creating space even in these highly dangerous construction sites and can develop to their full potential. But I think this is such an important point that we're focusing on the whole child, so that even in a constrained physical environment, organizations must address gross motor skills. So one example that I recently saw in El Salvador was that in an urban, densely populated area, there might not be much room or space for children to play outside. But what they did in the interior space was create so that children could practice walking up and down stairs, even within a confined physical space, but that enabled them to practice more gross motor skills. And so I think that's always important, that yes, children do need to play and move and exercise, and we want to integrate that into programming and daily routines, creating group work and peer-to-peer interaction, and that we definitely don't think that sitting at a desk and focusing exclusively on academic content and a didactic pedagogy is the best method for advancing children's development. Really creative programs now in parts of the United States and in Finland and in Norway and Sweden, where children, there isn't any curricula even where children are able to express or spend a lot of time playing outside and integrate with nature and the environment. And I think there are some really high quality programs out there. But it's mostly about, like you're saying, connecting to the cultural context and finding what's important to families and communities in that area. I think there's some other really high quality programs that have an emphasis on music and the arts. There's a program called AEIO2, in which a artist in residence from the community goes to the Early Childhood Development Center to interact with and work with children, because in that area there's a real focus on arts and culture and community, and so they want that to be instilled in children from a very early age, and they don't want the program to be too academic or overly didactic. So I think creating space for this all kinds of motor development, so both gross and fine motor skills. And then when possible, definitely to encourage children to interact with their environment and to get outside and be in the sun and play in large spaces. Be a balance between safety and security and making sure that children are always supervised. And so maybe that means, having fence around the Early Child Development Center, or just making sure that it's always done in a secure and safe environment. But I think that's a wonderful example and something we should definitely think about, especially in relation to climate change and sustainability of the planet. I think programs in education are starting to really focus on connecting children to the environment and making sure that children become stewards and caretakers of their environment and the natural surroundings. From a very, very early age, that they grow to have those values, because we believe they're so important. So I think that's a great point, Haifa. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So we have a question from Jolie Garfinkel, who asks, what are your thoughts about the discrepancy between research, policies, and proactive or action within early childhood development? So I think, unfortunately, this isn't unique to early childhood development. I think a lot of fields struggle with between different communities of practice. And I think partially that's because there aren't always incentives across these different communities for them to collaborate. In the same way we were talking before about why the Ministry of Health might not work with the Ministry of Social Protection or the Ministry of Education. I think that they're competing agendas, or that there just isn't always necessarily the work to connect across these different interest groups. So for example, researchers are often interested in publications or advancing the field or talking to other researchers. But I imagine many of us have had the experience of reading a research or journal article that seems totally incomprehensible, or it's full of jargon or vocabulary that doesn't relate to a parent or a practitioner. As we get siloed into our communities, and there isn't necessarily connection, right? So the researchers are just talking to other researchers and working within them, but they aren't doing the necessary work to bridge to policies. A related problem, but somewhat different, is that sometimes countries or programs will have beautiful, wonderful policies, but that's completely separate and distinct from what's actually happening on the ground. So I think one thing, the first step is, thank you so much for bringing up this issue. It's so important. And I think that awareness is the most important first step. We first have to recognize how distinct and separate and siloed our work is, to then consider what might be the necessary bridges between these different groups. And I think there are a number of different exciting initiatives, right? So the organizations that I mentioned before, for example, Action and the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, they now have initiatives which are specifically about translating research into policymaker language and research into action. Right, so identifying effective programs and policies, and then doing the necessarily legwork to get to the policymakers, to get to the government offices, right? And sometimes this just means sitting in an office, right? Or taking a dense and complex, very long article and translating it into bullet points, or translating it directly into feedback. But I think this is also this great opportunity for other NGOs and other practitioners and all of you to think about your own strengths and, what have you learned from this course, or what have you learned in your own experience? How do you translate that to other communities, to other individuals? Because I think another great example is, as practitioners, as professionals working in early childhood development, we might believe and have certain principles and understanding, communicate that to parents, right? Or older siblings or other people working in children's lives. I think it's always about translation and communication and understanding these bridges and the incentives of different groups. Makers and practitioners, what might incentivize them or what might connect them? How do they see the returns, right? So I think one interesting exercise that we've been doing recently is trying to get early childhood development onto the agenda of policymakers, right? How do we make it seem important? How do we connect with what are their interests and what are their goals? For example, enabling policymakers to connect to their electorate and better understand the needs and challenges that their constituents are facing. I think recognizing early childhood development not to be just an isolated intervention for young children, but to be an intervention for the entire family and for all of society, right? So it's the way in which we communicate these issues. And I think then it's about creating organizations and funding and interest in about working in the spaces in between these established fields. Organizations that are about connecting research to policy, are about ensuring that policy is integrated into practice. And so I think in that last part, it involves a lot of different communities, and it can often be very political, right? But from changing something from a policy or something like the Committee on the Rights of the Child, making sure that's actually translated into a national action plan that different sectors commit to, and then that's actually translated into action. So sometimes that means enshrining it into law, right, or to other policies to ensure that certain organizations or certain individuals are held accountable. So I think this is such an important issue, and that's being addressed in a number of different ways in different communities and cultures. But I think the most important thing is continuing to develop this awareness, to continue developing the language and campaigns and information that connects across these different groups and across their different interests. How can we ensure that researchers feel that their findings are important and relevant and connected, and that it is in their best interest to make sure that there are these collaborations? So a really wonderful example I have of this is I'm part of a research team right now that's being directed by Dr. Christina Whalen from the University of Michigan. That's a partnership with Boston Public Schools, entity in charge of the city of Boston's education, and we're working with their Department of Early Childhood on their universal pre-K program. And 4-year-olds, both within the public system and with community providers, and it's about creating research that addresses not only questions that are interesting for researchers, but are questions that are interesting for the practitioners and policymakers themselves. Collaborative partnership that I think more and more researchers and institutions are seeing as important and relevant to their ends. The previous question about conducting impact assessment and when to do that and how to secure funding, I think these partnership models and about making it interesting and relevant for politicians, for policymakers, is really, really important to connect research to policymakers, to practitioners. And I think creating these communities and bridging these divides is some of the most important and interesting work that people are doing right now for bringing up that issue. Okay, so looking for if we have any other questions. All right, great. So we have a question coming from Barton Creeth. And he said, I'd love to hear a bit more about how to scale up an evidence-based manualized program, but build in space within delivery for community participation, avoiding some of the pitfalls described in the reading. So this is a wonderful question, a really interesting issue. And I'd like to think that there are ways that we can avoid pitfalls, but I think there are always going to be challenges in in implementing programs, and especially with going to scale. And so I think it's a great question, and I think there's a lot of experience and research to help better go down that road, but there's always going to be some challenge, and I think it's important to recognize that. And so I think one approach then is to focus on being flexible and being able to adjust. And so one thing I think that's important is a little bit what we were talking before about process evaluation. The things that I think is really important that's developing, there's more of a research base and there's more information coming now, which is about what's often referred to as continuous quality improvement. It also falls under different names. So just if you look into organizations that are really committed to quality, I think that process is always about getting feedback, right? So you have mechanisms through which to understand what is actually happening to children on the ground, right? What is the lowest level of intervention of your program, whether that's a center or a home visit or something that's happening in the community, but how do you make sure that the decision makers are getting that information accurately, regularly, and within a certain time frame so that you can act and adjust. I think developing these feedback loops is so important. So in the interest of scaling up, I think one of the things that I've been working on, so right now I'm working on an intervention in Uganda, which is with primary schools, but I think it applies. And it's focusing on age parents and community members and the support and decision making that happens at the school. And we've been working in a relatively small scale because we're conducting a randomized control trial and doing some intensive research, but we are considering the process of scale. And so there, I think what's really important is that from the beginning, the question of scale is important to consider. Because oftentimes what happens is when you're focused on your program and your intervention, for example, we are working in 100 schools at this point, so relatively, sort of medium to small scale. Your goal is to make the program as effective as possible. So you want to do as much as possible. But you need to keep in mind, you only want to test an intervention potentially if it has the potential for scale, right? So making sure it's cost effective and making sure you're not doing something or implementing the program in such a way that it wouldn't be practical or feasible at scale. So I think the important point to consider is from the very beginning, always have questions about scale, right? So I think this is an important point that we can return to later. This was also brought up in the chat forum. Shamim Jawami asked about why early childhood care providers might hire people who don't have any experience in early childhood or don't have any licensing or certification. So I think workforce is a really important question at scale, right? If you're thinking about taking a program from small to large scale, potentially at national scale, who will be your workforce is a very different question than it is for in 100 schools, right? So even though right now the organization I'm working with, we're only working in 100 schools, we're working through providers who could potentially work at national scale. Important thing to consider is only focus on or be aware of and cognizant of questions about what might be possible at scale when you're starting at that small level. The next thing I think is in your research, and be mindful of things like mechanisms, right? We want to develop an understanding of not just, did this program work? Yes or no. But we really want to start as researchers unpacking and better understand why a program works or what is necessary for there to be this impact upon eventual outcomes, right? And so that's about understanding these pathways of impact or the theory of change, right? And really understanding what leads to what and what has to happen in order for there to be an impact. Break down programs, then when you're approaching scale, you have more understanding about what is necessary to actually realize your impact at a larger scale. We know that this has to happen, right? So for example, in our module with community participation, we need to know that parents' mindset is beginning to change, right? So we have different measures and interventions to understand how parents approach primary school and their roles and responsibility. And so then in the process of going to scale, we can check in and see, okay, is the mentality of parents changing? Are parents changing the way in which they approach the school and the intermediate outcomes that are really important? Because ultimately what we're interested in is children's learning, ability to read and write. But we know if this intervention to affect that outcome, we need to know about these intermediate steps. We need to know about mechanisms. So I think having this understanding, having an approach to scale from the very beginning is really important, potentially about avoiding some of these pitfalls later on. With community participation, I think this is a balance. Like, it's very tricky. Parents, community members have whole lives outside of school. And so I think acknowledging that and recognizing that and understanding parents' perspective and having really strong communication, I think, is important. And as we saw with children's development, I think generally it often comes down to relationships. Where parents feel welcomed in the early childhood centers, parents feel that they are seen and that their concerns and priorities are recognized. I think all of this is really important. But having some of these perspectives from the beginning, I think, can be really helpful. So thank you. That's a really important concern. We, Hiro and I, have been working with a number of other co-authors on a paper explicitly about scale in early childhood development and the global movement to improve access to high-quality early childhood development services. And so I think one of the things we talk about there is that oftentimes we think of there being two approaches. So one is small to big, the idea that you start with a small, high-quality program and then you scale it. Or you start big to better. You start with a big program, but then work on improving quality. So I don't think there's necessarily one perfect pathway about thinking about how to get to scale. But having more and more experience and understanding, again, I think it's important to have this perspective of what absolutely has to happen, right? Because there's some research. So for example, in Ecuador, there's been some research about early child education centers where the centers are of such poor quality that they actually harm children's development. So I think that's a really important perspective to keep in mind, because unless we reach a certain standard of care, unless we offer a certain high quality standard of intervention, we could even be harming children's development. So I think if we had to start okay, what level of quality must we have in order to consider scale? What do we have to ensure must happen in order to reach implementation, I think, is really important. And then I think community participation, even though it's challenging, can be one mechanism by which to do that. Fully on board, when they're engaged, when they feel supportive, when they feel invested in the children's development, I think that often acts as a buffer in supporting these different policies and programs. But it's about having high quality communication. It's about understanding where parents are coming from and the constraints that determine when and how they're able to participate in children's programs or in their development. I think having that perspective is really important. Okay, so we're almost running out of time here, but I think we have, let's follow up with this issue because I think it's such an important one. So Zui, thanks so much for writing in. We have the quote from the reading, Rethinking Evidence-Based Practice. I write, the challenge of funding is particularly formidable in locations where the reallocation of funds towards more effective interventions competes for well-established programs that have failed to document significant impacts, yet have built a strong and loyal local constituency. How do we avoid this pitfall? So I think this is an incredibly important point, and is definitely a real challenge. And I don't think we have too many examples necessarily of ways in which to address this situation, but I think we're learning more and more. And so one example that I'll give is, Hiro and I were recently, we just traveled a UNICEF office and some political partners about how to put early childhood development on a national agenda, how to get policymakers interested and engaged so that during the presidential election, early childhood is a priority. It's part of campaign promises and different platforms. And one of the issues that we ran into was that there's not that much evidence to say that group-based supports for parenting are very effective, right? So the idea that an organization or institution hosts a group, parents come with their children, they're given support about how to improve parenting or other practices with very young children. So Hiro gave the example of he'd visited a group-based program once where the parents sat off to one side, the children were taken somewhere else, and someone was just lecturing and giving information, and some of the parents even were dozing off. Or sometimes attendance isn't, very high at these group programs. And so there's a lot of accumulation that this center-based approach, this group-based approach, often isn't very effective. But what we've seen is much more effective is often when a single coach either visits a home or is able to work one-on-one with a parent and a child. So the coach is seeing the parent interact with the child, giving immediate feedback and pointers and support, is sometimes able to model a positive interaction with the child to show that that is effective. This individualized direct instruction that's based on the support of this environment. So Young Min So writes in to say, is home-based education, for example, in Cambodia, applies to what you're describing now? And yes, this is definitely, so home visiting programs in the United States and Cambodia and other places, there's been a lot of research to show that in Jamaica, the Reach Up and Learn program, this home visiting program for the neediest families, so the families that are struggling the most, this is what we've seen can be very effective in changing parenting behaviors and supporting these serve and return relationships and supporting positive development practices. This is what we've seen more evidence around. Where we don't have as much evidence, or we don't really see that some of these group-based approaches are working. Or they have a group-based program. And in some of our meetings, there's an individual who is in charge of this program who sort of challenged this finding, saying you can look at other countries or programs and say that group-based programs aren't effective and we should do something else. But we have such a history with this program and it's really important. We have longstanding care and practitioners. It's a major challenge, right? Where, first of all, just because we don't have evidence for a program or an intervention doesn't necessarily mean that it's impossible and that it would never have an impact anywhere. Right? Maybe the examples that have been rigorously impacted of group-based approaches have been of relatively low quality models. Or maybe an intervention in another context is doing something unique and different and is addressing a different set of needs that is actually really important and can potentially have impact. So I think that's one important thing to recognize. And two, another thing related to that is maybe we're really interested in a certain type of children's development. Group-based programs are doing something else. Maybe they're building solidarity across parents or within the community, and these parents are working on something else that maybe because we're focused on children's development, we're not measuring that, we're not capturing some of these other positive developments that might be happening as a result of the program. Recognize that even though we have, as researchers or practitioners, we have some evidence, we have some reason to believe that certain programs are more effective than others, we can never know everything. Right? And I think it's always important, first and foremost, to hear and acknowledge the perspective and experience of the people actually conducting the work, the people actually in the field, and building on those resources is the most important. Right? So one of the ways in which we approached that was saying, we're not saying a group-based program can never be effective. And we're not saying that the work that you've been doing for the past 20 years, hasn't been important. I think the most important thing in entering these contexts is, again, to acknowledge the work that people are doing, acknowledge the strengths and the experiences that people have had, and then think about how to integrate what we've learned from research into existing policies and programs, and then you adjust when necessary, right? So I think this gets back to the previous point about understanding we don't necessarily want to know whether this program worked, yes or no. We want to know why it worked, because then we have these principles that we can apply to different situations. So for example, what we've seen from home-based visiting programs or from these other interventions that are more individualized is the importance of individualized instruction. What happens is a practitioner or the trainer, either the community health worker, the educadora, or whomever the individual is, needs to see parents interacting with their children and give direct and immediate individualized feedback to that parent-child dyad. Standing in front of our group and lecturing the whole group on principles. They're watching parents interact with their children. They're giving targeted specific feedback to an individual parent with their child. Right? There's a way in which we can integrate what we've learned from individualized to a group-based approach. Right? Or maybe the group-based approach starts by just giving, general information that's important for the community to have, maybe about public health concerns or an upcoming election or just information that's general, but then the group breaks down into individualized feedback. Right? So there's a way in which that we can integrate or target so that you aren't coming in and challenging and critiquing the work that people have been doing. I think it's really important, this perspective of start with what you've got. Another really important thing I'd like to say is related to this idea of a deficit mentality. I think it's often, right, we look at certain challenging environments where it seems like everything's going wrong, right? Or children are facing, extreme challenges to their development. And you only see negatives, right? You only see the problems. It's also really important, even in these really challenging situations, to recognize strengths. Important on an individual level and on an institutional level, right? So going into and working with a parent, I think you first want to build on what that parent does correctly, right? You want to build on the love that that parent has for the child. You want to build on their concerns and priorities and what they might be doing well. And then you lightly introduce the critiques or what can be changed or addressed, or slightly amended. The same thing works with institutions, right? You don't want to go in and say, what you've been doing is wrong. We need to completely transform what you've been doing. We have an evidence program. We're going to bring this in. No, you want to acknowledge and recognize the specific strengths of the institution, what they've been doing correctly, how to build on that, and then you adjust and amend based upon other experiences and what's more effective than others. Experience is, working with other organizations where there was a rigorous impact assessment that was conducted of an intervention, but the researchers weren't sensitive in how they to the organization, and the organization said, we don't believe these results, we don't acknowledge them. Right? So it's important about developing these relationships from the beginning, and they're integrated into the research and they're integrated into the evidence-based programming and all these different discussions from the very beginning, that they feel a sense of ownership over the work, that they feel acknowledged and visible, and that their work is being recognized. I think that's so important. Foundation that you can do to improve quality, to turn more towards evidence-based programming, to incorporate not necessarily a program wholesale, right? You're not adopting every single aspect of the program and just importing it. You're interested in the underlying principles that lead to impact, principles into work that they're doing. So I think we're out of time here. So thank you everyone so much for joining us and for these wonderful questions. I just want to acknowledge, to end with, Dominique Lima. I think this is a wonderful question. She asked, what is the proven fastest way to scale up parent training interventions? I think that's a perfect note to end on, because that we don't necessarily have an answer to that, right? And it'll depend upon these relationships. It'll depend upon the institutional context and the organizational context in which you're working. And the most important thing, right, is to build on strong relationships, come in not just looking for challenges, but always have this approach of ultimately getting to scale, because I think in a lot of the areas in which we're working, there isn't necessarily a large base of early childhood programs. But I think that can definitely be seen as an opportunity, because I think it's much easier to introduce something and begin in a high quality evidence-based approach than it is, right, to sometimes adjust or change or challenge what somebody's already been doing. So I think it's about developing these supports, having this underlying experience of mechanisms and intermediate impact. And so I think that's a great sort of note to end on. So again, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. These are absolutely wonderful questions and really great feedback. Thank you so much for your participation in general. And we hope that you can join us next week for the last webinar for the course with Dr. Jack Shonkoff. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks so much for joining.